Hey, folks, before we get started on today's episode, make sure to check out the podcast show notes. You're going to find a link where you can download the Creative Operations Manifesto, which is what we're talking about on today's app. Thanks. Creative operations leaders, the story of your hero's journey has finally been written. The words and emotions that capture your daily battles, your triumphs, and your unwavering commitment to delivering excellence against all odds have been etched onto the pages of the Creative Operations Manifesto. Today, we're diving into this game-changing document with its creator, Shane Hegde of Air.inc, to explore how it's giving voice to your experiences and providing a roadmap for delivering what your creative leaders and organizations need. Shane is a co-founder of Air.inc. He's building a product informed by his liberal arts background and a deep appreciation for the creative process and the role that creative operations plays. His unique perspective on the challenges and opportunities facing creative teams has led him to create this manifesto that's giving voice to the way we need to approach workflow, decision management, collaboration, and so much more, so that creative operations leaders can design the right conditions for great creative work to spring forward. In this episode, we'll explore the key themes of the Creative Operations Manifesto. We'll discover why it's essential reading for anyone looking to take their creative operations to that next level. Shane will share insights on how to break down silos, harness the power of automation, and foster a culture of innovation and efficiency. So get ready to see your journey reflected in a whole new light and discover how the manifesto is finally telling the story of creative operations heroes everywhere. Let's dive in. Thanks for joining today. Been looking forward to this conversation. And we will definitely leave time at the end for some questions, or I may just go off script and, ask folks to jump in halfway through. We'll see how it goes. First time I'm actually recording any episode with a group of people in the room. Usually it's me and somebody else in some different part of the world on a Zoom call or something, and we're just hitting record. And this is definitely the nicest location I've been in. I'm usually in my kitchen with some horrible background. This is very beautiful. Must look awesome on a nice sunny day. All right. So we started every episode by asking the same question. And you're saying, like, you reached out to a whole bunch of folks and Jeremy responded to you. And your question was, what is creative operations? So my question to you, Shane, now that you've been in this space for a number of years, is what's your definition of what is creative operations?
I think creative operations is the aggregation of two things. It is day-to-day creative workflows that individuals who try to distribute and create content live in. It is the logistics. It is deciding what asset to use for an ad campaign. It is sharing content with a partner. It's getting feedback from someone who you didn't know you were supposed to get feedback from on a piece of content. And it's that plus it's asset management, which is how an organization thinks about storing and organizing visual data. And the marriage of those two things, from my perspective, is creative operation.
Okay. And we'll come back to some of what you shared there, but I want to dig into this manifesto that you and the company put together. This itself is a creative endeavor. And as I was going through the manifesto, the one thing that, even though I'm Canadian, the one thing that came through for me is like, it was almost like a bill of rights for producing great creative work. But at some point, this was a blank page. It was a blank canvas. Where did the inspiration for this come from? Why did you feel the need to create a manifesto?
Well, I guess first I would say it's less of a bill of rights and more a sort of declaration of independence.
Okay.
In that the book came from thousands of hours of conversations over the last 6.5 years that my co-founder Tyler and I have had with creative directors and creative teams who are struggling because there's this constant pursuit for more assets, more quality, and the investment, the team size remains the same. And, if anything, what we tried to do is take a lot of their emotions that they have felt in going through that process and first just lay them out so that as an acknowledgement of the fact that these emotions are real and they're validated. And then the second part of the book really starts to propose what we think is a solution to it. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say we're biased in our presentation of the solution and that we're a solution provider for creative operations. But regardless of whether a business chooses to work with us or not, the argument in the book is that orchestration, building a system of record for creative operations, having a specific platform for creative operations is what's required in this world today, given those emotions, if we want to address them.
So tell us about some of those emotions. What were the ones that particularly stuck out for you?
My favorite page in the entire book is a slab of meat and it says butchered. And that came from a conversation we had with a consumer creative director who was talking about how they felt that week about they were just about to complete a new campaign. And then the CMO and the executive came to them and said, hey, this is going really well, but we got to launch in this new platform. And we have to do this next week. And it's really hard to stare at a blank page and come up with an idea. Great creativity takes time. It takes nothingness, it takes a blank slate. And when you constantly throw on more and more and more use cases, channels, feedback loops, it challenges your ability to create something great. And that's what every creative individual and team really wants to pursue.
What else is getting in the way of great creative work? Is it always just a blank canvas, or is it just, you've used the word more a few times, is it just more stuff?
I mean, our perspective is that unequivocally, the use cases for images and videos have grown exponentially over the course of the last 10 years. If you look at the fact that the use cases around and you sort of unpack that, why that's happening, the first justification is that there's a bunch of different channels where you want to produce content and push it out towards. The second is that there's just more and more people involved. So even when you think about a place where you used to distribute content, it's becoming more complex because more people are involved in that decision-making process. 10 years ago, it was the marketing team had a channel, the creative built content for that channel. And if you look at it today, the complexity is the fact that now it's not just the dozens of marketing channels, but now the sales team wants to refresh assets. And now the partnerships team wants more assets. And now, Adobe has this saying that there's 900 million visual communicators around the world who work with images and videos every single day during the work week. You tell me, has the scale of creative operations grown enough in that same period to support that? And I think the answer is no. And the only thing that can is really automation.
Why don't you think it has grown?
Creative operations?
Yeah.
I think we haven't put a word to it. I think in some silos, even in this conversation, there's a few of us who maybe we have the same definition, maybe we have a slightly different definition of creative operations, but there hasn't been a true system of record for the creative process. It's been siloed and unstructured. And I think only now are we really starting to understand the power and impact of it, because we're existing in a world of endless content. And that's a recent thing that's happened to all of us. And so, I feel like in the last couple of years, we finally started to process that reality and try to figure out what we want to do with it.
Yeah. My point of view on this is that creative operations as a role or a function started off as a project management problem and solution. And I still think it's firmly rooted there. I first got into the space 10 years ago, and I can count the number of creative operations people on both hands and both feet, literally. And today there's, according to LinkedIn, 3,000 plus creative operations people. I think what you're getting at is that I think the vast majority are still stuck in that project management mindset, as opposed to the systems orchestration thinking that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Because here, what we're really talking about is like a continuous, always on supply chain of creative content. I've always had this like image in my head of like, there's somebody sitting at Toyota HQ right now in front of a wall of monitors, and they could see where every part for every car going to every car dealership is.
Yeah.
And it feels like that's where we need to get to with creative operations, because it is there's an unyielding appetite for content now?
Well, it's happened in other categories, right? If you look at a global sales organization, they're sitting inside of Salesforce and analyzing those dashboards. If you look at a progressive technology team, they're making those analyses and decisions based off of what they're seeing inside of GitHub. Our point, and I think you share it, is that today there is no central product or platform or place where that is happening today. And that's our ambition at Air.
Yeah, and it's funny. We just did this interview with a couple of folks from Under Armour, and they're talking about, like, every time they order a pizza to the office, like from Papa John's, they actually can see on the app where the pizza is. Like, is it being made? Has it been made? Has it been put in the box? Is it in the car? Is it on its way over? Right. And we have that same experience with like Uber Eats and so many other things. But when it comes to creative content, it's like, where is it? I've got to go and talk to 5 people to try and figure out, like, where is it in the supply chain?
Yeah.
Because we don't have that system yet. So I want to go back to the emotions for a second. You talked about butchered. And you mentioned you've talked to hundreds or thousands of like creative professionals. Do they get operations? Or is it, I want someone to do this?
I feel like I do these 15-minute calls. I try to do them 3 or 4 times a week with creative directors to try to get a pulse on how they think about their day to day, how they think about, their KPIs, what drives their work, when they describe their organization doing well. And I think there's this fallacy that exists in the category that there are left brain operators and right brain creatives, and the creatives don't understand the importance of the operation. That's the narrative out there, right? If you showed up to a person selling you an asset management solution, they would probably tell you that. They'd be like, you need the operators to come in and tame the creativity. And every creative director I've talked to a T understands the power of process. Process unlocks the space to be creative. To a T, every creative director I've spoken to believes that. And what they don't want to do is create process that, that complicates the path to being creative. You don't want to create process such that your creative has to create a final asset and then ping the damn librarian and then put the final asset in the DAM and then have the librarian come back to you and say, like, okay, like, that wasn't tagged the right way. That's never going to work. It's just not, because of the amount of pace and volume that you need to create. And so I guess I would say that if we do not create a world where operators and creatives can work together inside of a singular place, it will not work. And today I would argue that it has not worked. Our approach to solving this problem has not worked.
Do you think that's because the operators are taking that project management approach and they don't understand the creative process?
I will not say that. I think, from my perspective, it's not that the project management folks don't understand what's happening on the creative side. They're spending years of their lives studying this. They definitely understand what's happening, but it's different. It's way different of an understanding when you're having to do it every single day. It's way different. Think about the moment when you sit there and you've been given a brief and you're staring at a blank page and you have to figure it out and you have a deadline and it's really important. It's terrifying. There's no right answer there. And you're not thinking about process. You're thinking about what is going to end up on this page if you're a creative. And process should be the thing that enables all of the chaos to be pushed to the side for you to be able to have that level of focus. So they're looking at the same problem. They're just looking at it from a different lens. And I think what's required of operations individuals or project managers, as you've noted, is a immense level of empathy for that blank page problem. And, I think the tools that operators have to deploy or to work with don't help them make that case.
So I agree with that. One of the things you're getting at in this manifesto is, I think there's 2 types of workflows. One is a scale workflow and one is a storytelling workflow. Because there's a quote in here about creative minds need time to do nothing. Like, to actually look at that blank canvas, right? Like Da Vinci and Michelangelo used to just sit there for hours on end looking at a blank canvas. And, you know, in our sort of factory oriented world today, that might seem lazy, but to your point, you actually need that as a creative to come up with the great idea, the great story, to evoke the emotion to drive action with a prospect or a customer. So as part of the mission here and you also talk in the manifesto about like, we need systems to like scale decision-making and judgment.
Yeah.
So as a big part of this, like self-service and automation, so that the creatives can actually focus on the blank canvas and a lot of the work of actually generating content that I don't want to say is generic necessarily, but doesn't need blank canvas thinking and space.
Yeah.
Like, is that a big part of what we need to be focusing on?
I mean, my perspective is that production design, as an example, creating variants in different formats off of the same asset, going from not from 0 to 1, but from 1 to infinity. That's stuff that should be automated. That's stuff that you shouldn't have to burden an individual with. But the 0 to 1 problem, in order to get them to have the time and space to be able to actually accomplish that 0 to 1 problem, it's required that you remove everything else from the table. So I think, you know, I agree with you that you can characterize it as storytelling versus scale. Or you can look at it as, even if they're trying to do storytelling, there's aspects of collaboration that are required in that storytelling that take you away from actually focusing on what's the plot, who are the characters, what's the emotion I'm trying to get across. And those are the big, tall questions that we think and believe, regardless of where AI goes, humanity really needs space to be able to consider and evaluate.
Yeah. I think it's going to become so much more important in an age of AI, because I think right now what I'm seeing is the most boring use of AI, which is we're going to use these easy buttons to scale to infinite and move at the speed of light.
Totally.
And all we're doing is we're creating this tsunami of commoditized crap content.
Yeah.
And storytelling is going to come back as a necessary superpower to break through that tsunami. It's like going to be the new bat signal.
It's the quality of storytelling, but it's also the quality of orchestration. In a world of endless content, the only things that matter are what asset do I use? When do I use it? Why do I use it? Where do I use it? And those are the powerful decisions that creative director and operations leader, they need to pair on, partner on, and make decisions for.
So when you say orchestration, which is a $64,000 word, is that about like, you know, orchestrating all the components so that the right story shows up at the right time for an individual customer or prospect?
I'd say it's both that and the process.
Got it. Okay. So talk a little bit more about like, what do you mean by like scaling judgment and scaling decisions, like when it comes to the creative process?
Well, one, like, I guess our perspective for our business and on the category at large is that great creative work also takes collaboration. It takes, and it used to take, historically, it's taken rooms that kind of look like this, where you throw sticky notes up. Remember whenever you used to print out the pictures and stick them on the wall, and you would feel out photo shoots that way? You know, our perspective is, how do we scale that in a world where there's dozens of channels, where the rooms need to be bigger because there's more people getting involved, where everybody's asynchronous? And that's the magic we're trying to figure out how to scale. There are aspects of that where we can deploy software to optimize. Like, you know, if all of us wanted to give feedback on a video, you could send it out and people could comment, and they could make timestamp comments. They could circle things. Like, those are technology advancements that you can provide. But there's also, you know, automations that you can deliver that could support maybe the first leg of that, so you can get to the sort of root of the conversation. Maybe the automation could tell you that, oh, this end cut is different than all of your different end cuts across all of your videos, which would save the team time to be able to focus on what the actual plot is of the narrative. So I guess it's both deploying technology to automate what you're trying to do manually today, and to deploy technology so that you can only focus on problems that actually matter.
How do you determine what problems actually matter?
I mean, the beauty is I don't have to. You know, I've got 120,000 users that tell me which ones matter every day, and we circle through those and try to make an assessment. I think in this scenario, I am not the decision maker. I am at the behest of who's ever driving this process and trying to support them along the way. And what I've found is that the ambitions for what technology can solve have grown greater and greater over the course of the last 18 to 24.
Well, let's look at that question from the perspective of like a creative director or a creative operations leader.
Yeah.
In a world where there's a need for infinite content 24/7, and there's an unyielding demand coming from your marketing department, from partners and everyone else, how do you determine what to focus on?
Well, I guess I would first narrow it down to what can I automate and abstract that I'm okay automating and abstracting. Maybe I'm okay automating our performance marketing assets, whether that's through a partner or whether that's through a technology source, it doesn't matter. But if I can do that, maybe the core is that I focus on the message that gets distributed and then I publish that message out to the different places where it needs to go. Every business that I've talked to takes a different lens and perspective on where they are willing to sacrifice or automate and where they are not. And the hardest decision that a CMO or a creative operations leader has to make is extracting from their executive team or within themselves which side can I lean on for which aspect of the job.
What questions do you think they should ask themselves to determine what they should automate and what they shouldn't?
If I'm at a for-profit business, I'm making a bet on what's driving the business. What's driving, in the case of for-profit entity, revenue. What do I believe drives revenue, which usually comes back always to the customer. What is the best way for me to deploy a message out to this customer? And how do I do that most effectively? And in many, many business cases, that doesn't need to be an endless amount of channels or always on channels. And so, focus is really the sort of thing of our time. And again, our perspective is that you have to have a multi-channel approach, but that doesn't mean that you need to deploy manual work across all of these channels on an ever increasing basis.
Got it. Let's talk about you've talked to a lot of creative directors. You've talked to a lot of creative operations leaders as well. What, for this world that we are now entering of infinite, always on content, what qualities do you think or skills does a creative operations leader need to have? Because I still firmly believe the vast majority of people with creative operations in their title are still rooted in a project management mindset.
Yeah.
And I think for a lot of folks, to be very candid, they were a project manager yesterday and they're a creative operations professional today. And it's been more of a resume branding exercise than actually changing their approach to the job.
Yeah.
And really perhaps not even understanding what the new job is.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing I'll say is, and I'm biased on this, I get it, but I believe creative operations is one of the most pressing business challenges of our time. I believe creative operations is going to be what defines a successful brand or another one in the endless mix in the next 5 years. And when I think about the role of creative operations and what's required for an individual there to be successful, my perspective is that the function has to be in service of the creative department and of the creative director or the CMO, depending on how the setup of the organization is. And the first thing that has to happen is a perspective on what's the brand we're trying to build? What's the voice? Who's our audience? Why do we care about them? How do we want to reach them? How do we want to talk to them? And then the operations can just flow out of that. And so acknowledging that it is a service group at the behest of some mission that waterfalls down from creative director, that's usually where the hub is of the emotion inside of the organization, I think is the first step. And then everything you do changes if that's how you're operating. The minute you start saying like, oh, actually we're an infrastructure, we need to think about infrastructure and process and partner with the CIO to make sure that making sure we have really clean data and structures. That's going to become the operating principle of the systems and process and execution you have. And there's always going to be a tension with the creative team. Always. And I see this time and time again. Part of the reason that people come to us is because we love working with the creative team, and we are process people and like thinking with creative operations leader, and we can be that middle ground and work with both sides on an ongoing basis. And it's really challenging because they're very different people. And so the number one thing that I would say that a creative operations leader is required to have, I said it earlier, is empathy. It has to be empathy around the creative team and around the work of creativity.
Yeah, I often think I think creative operations leaders and the creative directors need to, I think together they need to first understand what is the purpose of creative in serving the needs of that business. Because it's going to be different for a Louis Vuitton versus a Walmart versus, JP Morgan Chase, right? Like the role of creative is fundamentally different in those three businesses. And then, yes, I agree with you. The creative operations leader needs to then partner with the creative director to go, how do we enable that right type of creative to come forward for this business to meet its needs and goals to drive it forward?
Or how do we index all of our processes so that we can protect that work and obfuscate everything else or automate everything else?
Yeah, because I think very often, and this isn't just a creative operations problem, it's people look at their job as like, that's my purpose. And it's like, no, the purpose of your job is to enable what the organization is trying to achieve.
Yeah.
So sure, your title might be creative operations, but it's creative operations to enable creative to do what?
Yeah.
Again, drastically different at a Louis Vuitton versus a JP Morgan Chase. I've also been thinking about like going back to scale and storytelling. Do you think there's going to be a need for like two different types of creative teams and two different types of creative operations leaders? Because I think
like the scale one and the storytelling one.
The scale and the storytelling one, because I think there's creatives who are really good at, creating templates that can then be plugged into self-service and automation systems. And that's just a different sort of creative, not like better or worse. And then there's the creatives that are really good with that blank canvas going, the entire brief is, I need you to evoke emotion X, right? And it's just like, where do I even start with that, right? And then the same with creative operations leaders. Like there's creative operations leaders that I think are better suited to enabling scale through self-service and automation.
Yeah.
And really taking those stories and then plugging them into that scale system.
Yeah.
And then I think there's creative operations leaders that are more like this chief operating officer to the creative director and going, how do I, to your point, and the entire point of this manifesto, how do I get rid of all the friction from like those blank canvas creatives and let them spend time staring at the canvas?
Yeah. I guess I won't argue that there can be creative operations leaders with different areas of focus or emphasis that might be optimal. Like Monday.com scales their business through performance marketing. If I was the creative operations leader at Monday.com, that orientation around scale and velocity would be really important to me. Airbnb really focuses on brand.
Yep.
Creative operations leader at Airbnb, I probably think about that. So I get the perspective there, but I guess I would say like, I've never met someone who writes Instagram captions and doesn't want to write a novel. Like the perspective I have is that like creatives care about quality and they care about depth, and a creative operations leader should as well, and likely does, because they're spending their life enabling great creative work. And quality is the important factor for those individuals, regardless of scale. And it shouldn't matter whether it's an Instagram caption or a novel, as long as the quality is there. And so I personally, I don't believe that there should be two separate creative directors or creative operations team, one for storytelling and for scale. I think there should be folks who really focus on quality and understand the give and takes of that and optimize accordingly. And I know there inevitably are, designers that might focus on like today on production design, but usually that's the entry point. And then you're working your way up to get to higher quality work, bigger campaigns. So I don't know. I don't. I guess I'm trying to say I don't like that world if that were to exist.
Why don't you like that world?
Because I think it makes it seem like in my head, every conversation I feel like I have about this with process folks, it seems and comes off as if scale is a totally different muscle, or that it, like quality doesn't need to be high, or that, the function of it is totally different. And I don't think it is. I don't think that if you're a creative, you're sitting there and you can't understand, okay, I only have an hour to produce this thing. Let me do the best I can in an hour versus I have 2 days to think about it, or 2 weeks or 2 months. And I believe in a creative's ability to flex across all those things and to cross the chasm of process across all those things. So I think it is a limiting view on nuance for a creative.
I'm having a flashback to my childhood. My mom going like, you have 5 minutes or you have 5 hours to clean your room. And I'm going to like take the 5 minutes or the 5 hours. All right. Yeah, I mean, I want to live in your world, but
Yeah,
I do wonder if we are trending towards a world where we're going to have like scale creatives and storytelling creatives. And we sort of see that in the in-housing outsourcing.
Well, I think a lot of the scaled creative is going to be automated.
Yeah.
That's the reality. And even part of the storytelling parts might be. So the job of the creative is changing. But yeah, I guess that's where I would note that one.
What do you think is changing most about a job of a creative?
I would say I think there's two things. One is the sheer scale and complexity of the orchestration and logistics. I haven't talked to a single person that is like, I've truly figured out how to get all of this. Like there's so many creative directors today that can't answer how much content are we creating, where all is it going, how is it performing. They need those insights in real time. And there's so much noise that it's really hard to get to real valuable insights on the creative side. Yeah, maybe that's the most important one by far.
What impact do you think AI is going to have on the job as a creative?
I mean, ideally, it's just further enabling the work. I don't believe in a world where the job doesn't exist. The job is going to change in parts. You're going to be able to do more. You're going to be able to, spend time tinkering and tweaking a model that really defines your photography style and then deploying that to start to take action. And I get really excited because we're going to have more space to breathe and think about the things at the highest level of brand that really matter. That's, I think, the power of getting this right. And power is not, okay, we're going to have to get really good at training people to like prompt and reprompt inside of a machine. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying is like the value of like I'm so biased because I have a liberal arts degree, but the value of a liberal arts degree is going to be immense in the next 10 years. English, philosophy, these cultural understandings are going to be critical versus technical skills that are going to be automated. It's an entire, my Indian mother would kill me for saying this, it's like it's a rework of how we approach problems. And I'm excited about the type of problems that a creative director is going to be able to live in and the power of the decisions that they're going to have out of that. Because for so long, the work was the opposite and was really challenging them. And now it's really going to lean into these tastemakers really, really helping scale and ship businesses.
Yeah, I think we're actually going back to the future in a way with AI because, as you said a moment ago, what AI is really going to do, it's going to take away that technical work. And I think way too many people, like creative or whatever role you're in, the job has been defined around the technology, right? Like, oh, I'm a Photoshop person or I'm a Final Cut Pro person. It's just like, no, the job always has been storytelling. We've just turned everything into a bit of a assembly line or a factory for the last few decades.
Yeah.
And I think now we're going back to a time where like, technology or like comfort with technology is no longer going to be a barrier. And now it's really going to be about like that core human job of storytelling, which we've done for millennia, right? We sat around the proverbial campfire and told each other stories of the past, the present, and most importantly, the future.
Yeah.
And I think like real storytellers, i.e. real creatives, I think are going to your point, are going to thrive in this time.
Yeah.
Like they really are.
Maybe that's why I don't like this worldview of like scale versus storytelling creatives. To come back to it.
I think I don't like it either. I think it's going to happen for a while because I think it's human nature that we always go for path of least resistance. And I think organizations right now, most of them, the way they're thinking about AI is scale. I can scale to infinite in terms of volume and move at the speed of light.
Yeah.
And that's what creative operations is. That's sort of been the holy grail of creative operations.
Yeah.
I think mistakenly for the last 10 years. But I think like storytelling is going to punch through again because it's going to be that bat signal to break through the tsunami of commoditized content.
Yeah.
And it's going to be required. So I know we're getting at time here and we want to leave some time for question. Just, one final thing I wanted to ask you is like, I think you've already touched on a lot of this, but in terms of like looking out ahead for the next, 1, 3, 5 years, what are the trends that you think we should, be thinking more about as opposed to like navel gazing? So I'm a creative operations leader at Acme Inc. And, I spend most of my day just thinking about the fires I got to put out, but every now and then I've got a bit of time to do some crystal ball gazing. What should I be thinking about?
You're a creative operations leader?
Mm-hmm.
I think what I've loved seeing from, and I can only speak to the customer base and folks we work with. I've loved seeing the power of going back in time through an organization and looking at these historical trends and understanding of what has happened in the past. And, my perspective on where business will be in 5 to 10 years is a fundamental acknowledgement of I will be wrong. I don't know what new platform is going to come out. I don't know, which channel is going to really matter to us as a business in 5 to 10 years. But what I can do is go back and really look at what has worked in the past. What stuff have we done really moves me as a creative operations leader, or do we feel like worked really well? And I can try to take that nugget of value and extrapolate it around what we should do next or inspire towards where we should go. And I think that a lot of creative operations leaders today don't have the luxury of enough of a data set to be able to guide and make that decision. And part of what we hope to bring with partners is the ability to go back through that stupid photo selects process where it was really heated and a bunch of people debated something and they came to a really critical conclusion. And there was like a thing that unlocked the conversation. And if we can bottle that thing and someone can come back to it and notice it, then that's going to drive whatever they do next, regardless of whether TikTok gets banned in October. And so that's my take.
All right. Very cool. Thank you. I'll come back with the final question later, but want to open it up? Anyone have any questions?
Well, I just want to say this is a fascinating conversation. As a creative person in the room, I just nodding my head, like either literally or metaphorically almost the whole time. But what actually one interesting thing you said that I'm curious about, as a also English major, I couldn't agree with you more that the things that you learn in a liberal arts program are probably increasingly valuable. But the trend has actually been sort of the opposite. Like if you look at higher education, the last 10 years, the number of English majors has dropped by like a third. So, and at a lot of schools, those programs have shrunk because there are not even enough people who want to major in English or philosophy. So if you're right that the long-term trend is to enable storytellers, and storytellers need to have those critical thinking skills, those liberal arts skills, but we've been training people for 10 or 15 or 20 years to move away from those fields of study. How do you re-engage people around what you think those critical skills are to do that kind of storytelling?
Well, I mean, the first thing I would say is this future that I think we've all seen has really started to accelerate in the last 18 months. So the data is going to be a lagging indicator. I think one thing that, and there's this really great daily, I hate referencing the daily because it's like miserable. But anyway, there's this really good daily piece about the like rapid decline in college applicants. And I think my take on that is a lot of the technical skills you don't need to go to college for anymore. You can pick up on YouTube and watch a few videos and go that route. And I think as that happens, you will start to see the shift in the numbers around the acceleration on the liberal arts side. I also think like we're still figuring out. I mean, I don't know if any of you watched the OpenAI presentation earlier this week, but we're still figuring out what this technology can do and its advancements. And the tough thing is all of us are sitting in jobs where we're being asked every day how we're applying it and how we can use it. And we're thinking about that critically. So maybe I'm a little early on that assessment. Maybe that's a 10-year view versus a 18-month view. But you can even start to see, like, read the job applications for prompt jobs, and you can see it in there. You can start to like feel out where they're waiting, which individuals to really start to work with. I don't know, that would be sort of a thing to help make my case.
I'll add my 2 cents to that. I think what we're going to start to see organizations increasingly like interview for is just simply curiosity. Like that will be the only thing not the only thing that matters, but the key thing that will determine if somebody's going to be successful. And the reality is, it's like our schooling system and our work systems for the last, 5 to 7 decades have not valued that. Like most CEOs go, I want curiosity, I want creativity, I want innovation. But the reality is the way, and I've been a CEO multiple times, the way we run organizations is we have an org chart and we have boxes on the org chart. We're like, sit in the box and do what's in the box, right? But we're living in a world now where AI is going to take away all that technical complexity. And I believe what we're about to enter is a super cycle of commoditization and innovation. Because our entire history is somebody innovates, everyone else copies, then it gets commoditized, and eventually have to innovate again because, as like human nature is, we need status and differentiation because we're competitive creatures. But that's always happened on a relatively like sort of slow burn. But if we're all getting these AI superpowers now, that whole, innovate, copy, commoditize cycle is going to accelerate. And it is going to force us to innovate at a faster and faster and faster pace. So it's not going to be about technical capabilities. It is going to be about like, am I curious? Like, am I connecting dots that nobody has connected before? And I think that's what we're going to be looking for. If I were interviewing for a job, I'd be looking for an organization that truly values curiosity. And if they don't, I don't want to work there because I'll be painting myself into a corner.
One thing I think is missing from the conversation you just had is the role of the brief and the data in the brief to drive the right assignment. And so often the lack of empathy is caused because the right assignment is the reason for something being done is not apparent. The brief is not clear, and so creative ops person and a creative person are set up in oppositional relation to each other, which can have a really deleterious impact on that entire kind of like chain of empathy, right? How do we fix that? How do we fix that in your product or in other products where we actually connect the reason to create something to the creation of something? How do we fix that?
I'm going to punt actually to Tyler, who I think will have a perspective.
It's my question makes sense.
No, it totally does.
I feel you, Rip. Well, I think that the solution is probably to use the stuff that's being created to sort of feed the beginning of the cycle again. This is one of the things that we talk about a lot of here is how does the stuff you've already done become sort of the sketch, the sketch that fuels the next campaign. So I think it's less of like a, start finish, linear process and more of a circle that's, kind of feeding on itself. So, it's a bit of a different mindset, but that's at least how we think about solving that problem. It's less of a, brief starts here, final output is here, and more than nothing's ever done. You're always kind of remixing and rematching and making new content from the existing stuff.
I haven't talked to a creative director at an agency in the last 3 months who isn't using Midjourney to help develop their briefs. And the level of clarity that work is providing the creative who actually executes on the campaign, for whatever reason, seems to be much higher and have a ton more resonance.
And is that something you're working on in terms of like connecting? Because again, I think there's a third voice in this discussion, which is like who's speaking for the customer. I guess it's the marketeer in this case, right? Who's the voice of the customer, the data that's incentivizing action here that can often lead down the wrong path, right? And then you've got to pull it back, and suddenly that blank page is now a blank bus, and now it's a car, and now suddenly it's an airplane. It's like that's where things go so wrong. Like we worked together for 10 years, and some of the most tense moments we had is where the brief was just fakakta, right? And that's where that empathy just goes away.
Yeah.
So I often think about that inception point and like, it's the stress moments where you lose the empathy.
So I don't think it's obviously not an easy answer, but I think there's a few things to like for creative operations leaders and creative directors to do. When we talked about this during the conversation is I think both of those individuals need to root themselves in a firm understanding of the business. Most creative operations leaders, most creative directors, I would say often do not have an understanding of what business are we actually in. Because like most of us, they look at their job as the job as opposed to step back and say, what does this company do? Like, who do we serve? Right. Versus my job is to produce a whole bunch of really cool creative, or my job is to get a bunch of stuff through the supply chain, right? It's like, one, what is the business? Two is both of those roles have to become more comfortable with data. And I think, companies like Air and others are like doing a good job of like trying to bring more of that data into that decision-making process. But data often can provide an answer as to like, what should we do? I need to triage because I've got 100 requests and we could only fulfill 80 of them, right? And data could be used there. It also has to be counterbalanced by that empathy you were talking about for that creative director, that creative operations leader to go, I know the data is saying we should do X, but the data is telling me, and my experience is telling me, and the past is telling me, here's what we should do instead. So there's no clear black and white answers, but to me, it's those like three things that creative ops leaders and creative directors need to root themselves in. And I think that is foreign to most creative directors and creative ops leaders.
I also think, Jeremy, the job of technology is to make those iterations and moves easier and easier and easier, so that, okay, cool, we want to remove this phone and add a bus into the image. Great. Let's do that. Right. Like and obviously it's not great today, but it's getting there and it's slowly improving. And those are I think, to your point, the paper cuts are what ruin the creative process today. And if technology can help address those paper cuts, hopefully, we can get to a better place.
I don't know if that solves the audience element, though, of your question. And I think that when I'm hearing about the tension that we're talking about between like the creative operations person and the creative person, it feels like it's almost not zoomed out enough, because some of the dynamics that are at play here are about like how brands are connecting with audiences and where leverage is. And it feels to me as though the paradigm flip that's happening here, kind of regardless of AI, already with the social channels that we have already, is that like for the past 70 years, brands have been very used to kind of like dictating, like, this is our vision for what the brand is. And I think that's the brands that are the most exciting that exist now come from the other direction. So the listening for who the customer is and being really diligent in not misinterpreting who you're trying to target. And I don't mean target in like the pejorative sense, but just like what story are you telling? Like that's the part of it where I feel like when you were talking about like the loop that needs to be closed, like that's a really big part of the loop. And like the culture that we have now, like, is not ready to support that, like from a mindset perspective or from an operational perspective. So when I think, when you guys are talking about like the scale versus the story, like for me, that's the primary variable that sticks before everything else. Cause it's like, it's a market force, it's a social force, and we have to learn how to live inside of it. And the people who are going to be empowered by technology will be able to break through and the bat signal will shine. But like, the problem is like, who are we serving? And do we have a clear idea of who that is? And are we being arrogant or not inside of that about like, there's a difference between who you want your brand to serve and like who it serves. And you have to like, it's wu wei. You have to go in the direction of the flow as much as anything else. And I think like from the creative perspective, that's one of the difficulties where like people have to give just more away.
A lot of brands that I used to work at and that I still work with still have both separate social creative teams that think that social creative is a whole separate thing.
Yeah.
Like, and interacting with people that want to have more brand control of social is just a whole different thing. It's a scale versus a story. It's like that just isn't the way consumers consume anymore. So like,
Robbie, how do you and the team at Cardinal sorry to think about it? I feel like modern business, technology forward.
Yeah, I think we're definitely overwhelmed by the channels and the platforms. But I think you raise a really interesting point. I think a lot of I've spent an equal amount of time at agencies and in-house, and I think there's always been a disconnect between who, like, the love for the product. Like, I worked at Facebook and none of the creatives like wanted to use the product. I was like, hey, that's a problem. Where the paycheck comes from. But I also do think it's okay that who the customer is and who you want to appeal to, like, can be separate, as long as you know that. But I think sometimes we do create work for ourselves, and we do, like, agencies are named after ourselves. If they're like the most creative things in the world, they have like the least creative names. I always find quite interesting. But yeah, I think the channel thing is interesting. I think the brands we all admire the most, like, just because there's channels doesn't mean you have to put some things into them all the time. I think if we went around the table and the brands that we admire, like, aren't always like pumping content out. And so I think that's like another thing. Like, there are more spaces, more places that we need to put things, but that doesn't mean they have to be there all the time.
Especially if it's an anxious reaction to put something there because it exists, as opposed to like actually having a thoughtful impetus behind it of like, our customer is there. We can tell a really beautiful story there. Like, those are good reasons, not like it's a new channel, like we have to put something inside of it as like a primal gut reaction. Yeah.
And I think we forget like who the competition is. Like the competition for this event, like isn't another event. It's like dinner with my girlfriend's time. Like it's like, so I think like because of these like new channels and the places and spaces we can be, I think we like need to reevaluate who we're competing with. And the only finite resource in the world is time.
So I'll throw a question out there. You're talking about how currently most teams are organized around the channel, like social versus other channels, right?
I don't know most, but I know except for all. Yeah.
A lot of teams are like, that's like, it's pretty common. And that to me is an indication of why we might end up getting scale versus storytelling in the short term. I also think there's a future where companies start to look more like venture studios in a way, where small teams are organized around market opportunities and challenges. And to Shane's earlier point, that's where I think like real storytellers come to the fore. Like, do you see something like that happening?
I do think small, nimble teams organized around actual commercial imperative, cross-functional and matrixed, but having a bunch of different skills on the team so they could actually be delivery focused, but enabled by a technology that is not restrictive.
Because then you're focused on the customer and the opportunity, not the channel.
Yeah. But I do think there are certain core KPIs that those teams need to deliver around, and they need to be self-sufficient. So they can't be waiting for an executive on high to be able to be like, oh, sure, yes, they approved that asset. They have to be able to be a little bit self-governed if they're truly in like a venture. So I think there have to be some, on my personal opinion, is there have to be some conditions in place for that innovation, that kind of venture concept to take off. And then as maturity takes over, no doubt, just as has happened with digital shelf or AI, those things tend to get co-opted into a corporate structure where they get corporatized, unfortunately.
Yeah, I feel like at the core of what you're saying, it's like, we were talking about this earlier, Nish, but like this idea of you can't give, as a brand who's trying to maintain a brand, the idea of giving the power to such an autonomous team who might make decisions that are so far outside of what the perception of that brand is, even though it might be super performant or super interesting. Like, everyone's going to have to relinquish their idea of control to some extent in order to like sustain this creativity.
Want the results, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, they want the 1,000 dicks. They want the elf beauty
Yeah.
campaign, right? They want the results. They just don't want the process.
Well, doesn't that come down to values? I mean, isn't that how you define if you're empowering people to go out and creatively solve problems, which is, what I think a lot of our job when we worked together was about. We were creative problem solvers. If there are values for that group of people to adhere to, and everyone agrees on what the values are, then they should be empowered to go and solve those problems. And you shouldn't worry about them solving the wrong problem or coming up with the wrong solution.
Well, it depends on if they're inside or outside the company. Like, if it's a agency model, then I feel like there's more risk than if it was like an incubator inside of the company. Then I agree with you completely. Yeah.
But even if you're engaging partners, those partners have to understand what the brand's values are and the team's values are, and they have to really live them in the way that they approach that work.
I have a question, because I think at the core of what everyone's saying here, there's something about, there's the risk element, right? There's the process element. There's the ideation element. But for me, if I were to answer the same question that you asked, Nish, about what do I think that creative operations leaders like need to be thinking about, I think the number one thing that creative parts of organizations need to be doing is finding ways to like quantify their impacts and articulate their impacts to the rest of the organization. Because I come from the world of like creative and retail, and it's not an investment mindset. Let's put it that way. It's like, what's the minimum that we can do with the least amount of risk And that's not an interesting place for the creatives to be. And it's not a place that actually creates leverage with audiences and does interesting things for the businesses. So what gives? Like, it's that for me is the least interesting version of the world, regardless of whether it's the scale version or the story version. Like, both of them fit into that same box. So like, what do we do about it?
I do wonder sometimes if it's as simple as like renaming or rebranding the job of creative to storytelling. Because creative is like, unfortunately, it's perceived as a service, a commoditized service. And as we get more and more tools like Midjourney and things like that out there, I think for the folks that have never been in the creative trenches or don't have an appreciation for the work that actually goes into like looking at the blank canvas and creating something that moves you, either you hate it, like some people have hated the Apple ad, or you love it. It does get treated like, oh, just chuck it over the wall and it'll get done. And as we get these AI tools, oh, I could press a button and I got an image or I got a video. And it's just like, no, the job is actually storytelling,
not commodification. Yeah.
Yeah, to that note, like I think one of the things that will be most disruptive, I'm going to make an AI prediction, is actually the account planning side of the business. I find that I'm less so glad you brought up briefs earlier, because the way that a brief happens today is, here's the brief, and I'm a art director, so I'm, creative freelance. Everywhere I go, it's like, here's the brief, run at it. There's very little time to question the brief. How did we arrive at this? Looking at a more macro perspective of like, just I'm working right now of the QSR brand, really big, multinational brand. We all probably been into their restaurant before. The biggest thing is actually QSR as a category is, at least in the United States, is really struggling. This brand, the way that this brief was set up, was that this brand is uniquely struggling. And so the creatives take that as, that's the tone, that's the answer, let's all run at that. And I had a CMO I used to work with, used to talk about sometimes, like, you get into a place, an office, it's like youth soccer. Everyone's running at the ball together. No one's playing their position. I get into sometimes this feeling where I think the biggest thing will happen with AI for creatives is the conversation component, the conversation economy that we're seeing that's building around like, hey, I still have questions. I'm so curious. Oh, my planner is in back-to-back meetings all day, but I still don't think I have the answer here. I want to know more about this category. I want to know more about this product. I want to know more about, I need a dossier on this particular, I'm working on right now on a product that has been around for 5 years, that quarter after quarter sales have slumped for the last 5 years. I want more information as a creative to inform that. The brief doesn't go deep enough. And I think where I can go as a creative is to talk to a chatbot and get information there, get more, that's really where I want to be as a creative. I don't need more. I love Midjourney. I love Runway. I use all the tools. I'm overserved there. The curiosity thing that keeps getting brought up, I'm not there. I'm not really getting fed that way. And I'm going on YouTube and watching CNBC or Business Insider videos, hoping that they get some morsel of information. But that's really where I see AI going. Again, less than out replacing creatives, but actually like arming creatives with more information to make better informed decisions around what they're going to output.
I hope it keeps us honest also about what our principles are associated with the brand. One of my favorite stories that I've heard in the last few years was the CMO of Procter & Gamble, sent out a brief to a few different agencies. I was interviewing the executive creative director at RGA who submitted a bid. And the bid was all about how in the U.S., most East Asians rename themselves in the U.S. And it was an acknowledgement of like, here's what my real name is. The campaign was a basis of like, announce what your actual name is. And it performed awfully, terribly in all of the results. It like failed the first briefing process. And the CMO sat down with the CCD and he was like, well, look, like the data is telling me that you've clearly gotten cut, but I love working with you. Like what's going wrong here? And he was like, look, we picked one of your principles in the mission statement, just one. And we only indexed on that one. And I don't know who you canvassed, but I guarantee you it's going to hit this one. And they retested it purely across that one within the consumer group of East Asians. And it absolutely ripped. And then they launched it and it was their best performing campaign in the last 5 years. And I think the interesting thing that will happen is as these models really start to understand our brand voice and our photography style and all of the little nuances that make a brand what it is, its ability to check that, I think, is going to become really interesting. That could happen in scale or in storytelling. It doesn't really matter, but I get really excited about that because it'll take into account all the attribution stuff, but it'll layer the context on top of the attribution in a way that we just don't today.
I do really like the idea of like as you're saying, what happens before the brief? If I have some sort of like AI assistant that I could just have an ongoing conversation with to help me better understand this customer, this market, like trends, things like that. I think that would be incredibly powerful.
Well, thank you all again for coming. This is an incredible conversation. I'm really glad we got to get everybody involved. It's really tough to sit under the gaze of this man. He is the godfather of the space. He's been in the category forever. So a huge thank you to Nish. He's incredible. Jeremy was actually just making fun of him earlier, and he was like, Nish is the only one who shows up to these Henry Stewart conference and has nothing to sell. He's just there because he loves talking to people about creative operations, and it comes through every time I get a chance to talk to him. So,
well, I'm glad I got to meet you because you got a liberal arts degree. I don't have a degree. We should get our moms together and and they'd be like, "What happened? What happened?" I'd be like, "But we're on a podcast together now. Isn't that awesome?" They'd be like, "Where's the medical degree?" No, but this is awesome. Thank you very much for doing this. If you haven't read it yet, like this manifesto is amazing. Like I remember when I got it, and Ariel had mentioned it a couple of months before, and it's like, all right, we'll see what this is. Is it going to be like, am I going to go off in the woods like Ted Kaczynski and read this thing? And then I sat there and I read this, in one shot. And as somebody who is not a creative by training, this spoke to me as well. Because I think like to be human is to be creative. And we are all in today's world being asked to produce more and more and more. So I know this is done for creative directors and for creative operations people, but I think this applies much more broadly. So thank you for doing this.
Thanks.
And thank you for doing this with me today. And thank all of you for participating in the conversation.
Website comes out. There's an interactive book that's going to be online in 2 weeks, I hope. So we'll send you all the link. But thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it.
That's a wrap for today's episode. Remember to please do 3 things. Number 1, head over to creativeops.fm and sign up to that companion newsletter. Number 2, whatever your favorite podcast player is, please hit subscribe. Search for Creative Ops, all one word, Creative Ops Podcast. Make sure you don't miss the next episode. And remember, number 3, this isn't just my journey of curiosity. This is our journey of curiosity about all things creative ops. So if you've got a question or maybe a different perspective about what you heard today, or maybe you just want to share something that you're curious about, drop me a line at nish@creativeops.fm. Thanks so much, and I look forward to catching you at the Creative Ops Water Cooler for next week's episode.